Hello dear friends and welcome to the GEOCOAST. Today we're visiting a very interesting place, an island in the middle of Cork Harbour called Spike Island. And here I'm meeting with Tom ONeill, who put his heart and time into developing this island as a tourist attraction. Hello Tom.
Good morning, Axel. Welcome to Spike Island.
So tell me Tom, what would be your personal connection with this island?
Well, I suppose I have no personal connection as such. I didn't know anybody here, but I've been here working since 1989 on almost on a permanent basis. Prior to that then, I was here during the riot of 1985, and I suppose my first occasion I visited the island was a young member of the Army Reserve in about 1980.
So you worked here in various capacities, yeah?
I did, yeah.
And how did you evolve from being a prison officer to being a historian and actually the tour guide?
Well, what happened was I was transferred down to Spike Island from Cork Prison in 1989 as I suppose the civilian comparison would be as a facilities manager. And as a facilities manager then I was here until 2003, and I was transferred back to Cork Prison. When the prison closed in 2004, then it came under the responsibility of Cork Prison again, so I was back responsible for the upkeep of the island. And in 2009 then, when it was decided to hand it over to Cork County Council, I was the liaison officer between the prison service and Cork County Council, and then I became a member of Cork County Council. Then I was employed by Cork County Council as the what I suppose the equivalent would have been the assistant manager, and eventually I managed the island then for about 6 years until it became it's like a much busier location. And then John Crotty became general manager and I was assistant manager, so I've been here in various capacities right through.
And when did your interest in history of the island started? Like, was it when you were working as a prison officer, like when you started to be interested in the history of this place?
When I was here as the facilities manager, because it immediately prior to it opening as a prison, it was a military fortification, and of course there were lots of guns here, lots of large artillery items, and being the facilities manager then I had staff and I had some of the inmates working with us, and I was able to redirect them to do some restoration work, because even while Spike Island was a prison, it was a very popular destination for the families that had been associated with the island immediately prior to it becoming a prison, and that included those that were related to the Republican prisoners that were held here in 1921, and also the families of the British troops that were part of the garrison here until 1938. So and that was most amazing, when it was an operational prison, it was still a very popular destination, and we were regularly receiving requests from civilians that had some sort of association with the island to visit.
So visitors would be allowed even if they didn't have any personal relatives in prison at that time? Yeah?
Yes, yeah, if they were connected. So those that were related to the prisoners and internees of the War of Independence, the British troops that were here until 1938, and the Irish families that were here then until 1985 when the prison took over.
And now Ireland became a major tourist attraction in Cork Harbour. There's boat tours, we just a few minutes ago disembarked the ferry, and the next one will be arriving in a few minutes, so we'll see people visiting the island. But I guess there was a big transition and a lot of things had to be done to actually convert the island from what it was to become a tourist attraction. So what were those modifications that you had to do here?
Well, the major work, because it was closed as a prison from 2004 until it opened, it was transferred. The transfer from the Irish Prison Service to Cork County Council happened on the 11th of July 2010. So really, in the 6 years it was closed, the vast majority of the work was basic maintenance. Get the lawns, get all that area that had been totally overgrown, get it back to the pristine condition it was in. And other than that, there was very little work carried out then to open it as a tourist attraction. when it was handed over on the 11th of July, and there were public tours here almost within a week. So there was very little modification done for the first couple of years. The major modification took place then after that, when it was opened, and I suppose the real major modifications happened over the winter of 2015. And what you see now as a major tourist attraction was really developed over that winter of 2015-2016, and the present fort then really took shape at that time. So the major work and the major expenditure was during the winter of 2015.
And Tom, can you explain what is the current management structure of the island? For example, you are employed by the county council, but you're overlooking the activities on the island, or is there a separate management company? What is the mechanism of running it as a tourist attraction?
Well, what happened was, in order to run Spike Island in a sort of a tourist methodology, if you like, the Cork County Council set up the Spike Island Development Company, and there's a board of that Spike Island Development Company which oversees the management and the development of the island, and they're all senior members of Cork County Council. And John Crotty then is the general manager of Spike Island, and he's employed by the Spike Island Development Company.
Is it a private limited or is it a public limited company?
It would be, I'd say, a public. It would be under the auspices of Cork County Council.
And now we see a ferry boat with another group of tourists visiting the island. Is it right?
Yes, and this is a CIA tour, and they've just arrived in Cove by CIA coach, and they're getting a full tour of the island then for approximately 3 hours.
And how many groups do you have throughout the day?
Well, because it's sort of at the end of the season now, there will be various groups, but there are 2 other scheduled ferries then to arrive. There's a scheduled public ferry to arrive at 12 o'clock today, and the second one at 2 p.m.
And are the ferries run by private subcontractors or by the county council as well?
The ferries then are operated by Doyle Shipping, because they're the expertise both to operate and to maintain and manage the boats.
So we see a group of people arriving to the island, and what is what are they going to see today, Tom?
Well, the procedure now, as with all individuals and groups arriving on Spike Island, they're going to be met by our tourist staff, who will give them a welcome and safety brief and invite them to participate in a guided tour, which we always advocate that first-time visitors to Spike Island make use of the guided tour. And that guided tour will last about 45 minutes, and then everybody they will be issued a map, and everybody then will have the opportunity to explore and discover the island for themselves, and make use of the wonderful tea rooms that we have on Spike Island with home-baked cooking. So, and then approximately 3.5 hours later, then the ferry will depart. Now, some of those then will wish to extend, and that's available then as well.
And what would be the main attractions on the island?
The fort. The fort is the big one. We'll take them from here up to the fort, and include some of the attractions within the fort, and then they'll have an opportunity to explore and see the...
Tom, good morning.
Good morning.
What's wrong? We're doing an interview.
Listen, good to see you.
I shut down the
We'll see
interview
you.
today.
Oh, look. Thanks for the heads up. So that's the tours now. So you've got the CIA tour group plus some public as well, including some former members of the Army Reserve.
So I suppose now we can go around the island and can show me the main attractions and just tell about the history of the place.
And what a beautiful morning you've chosen to come to Spike Island.
It's absolutely beautiful, and no wind.
Well, some people think the sun always shines in Spike Island, but yeah, okay. Right, Maxime, let's go. Okay, so Maxime, we're now almost at the top of a slight incline, and that will take us into the fort. And inside in the fort then, There will be plenty of surprises for our visitors because everybody is amazed at the extent of the infrastructure and the architecture in there. So let's go. We're now at the entrance to the fort, and the fort is surrounded by a dry moat. And this was part of the defence of the fort, because the fort was built to defend the harbour. But in order to defend the harbour, it also had to be able to defend itself. And by digging a massive dry moat around the fort, it made it much more difficult to be attacked or to be captured in the event of somebody attacking. However, the forts in the harbour were so strong, no enemy ever actually attacked it. Therefore, none of the guns were ever fired in anger. They were fired, but never in anger. When the prison was operational, there were several projects that had to be carried out just to help us work here. And one of those was to restore the roadway from the pier to the fort. And we added 3 small jobs during that, and that was to remove 3 cannon that were buried as bollards on the pier. So this is one of the 3, and you can see now it's standing proudly with its the second one outside the main gate of Spike Island. It dates from the late 1700s, so the late 18th century, and it was only the barrels were buried, and they were buried as bollards so that those using boats could actually tie up the boat safely on the pier. So now we've excavated them. They were excavated around 1999, and 2 of them are outside the main gate, and you'll see the 3rd one later then inside in the gun park. We're now in the middle of the square, and we're within the fort here on Spike Island. Originally it was called Fort Westmoreland. Then around 1951 it was renamed Fort Mitchell after the Irish revolutionary John Mitchell, and now we refer to it as Fortress Spike Island. There are several buildings that date back from around 1800. So from on one side here we have what we refer to as the 1916 block. The reason we refer to it as the 1916 block is because it was burned down in 1916, and over the years it was used for officers' quarters, it was used as a convict accommodation, and it's generally now accepted that it was in this block that John Mitchell was held in 1848. The next block then, as we go around, is the A block. The A block has an amazing history because, again, it was used as the enlisted ranks accommodation for both the British and the Irish Army right until 1985. It was used for the Republican internees in 1921, and during the mid-19th century it was used to house convicts, because as part of the Spike Island was first built as a military fortification towards the end of the 1700s. And this massive fort that we're standing in now, Fort Mitchell, was built between around 1804 and finished around 1860. It took quite a while to build, and it cost approximately £1 million sterling to build. The A block was used for enlisted ranks accommodation, and for that purpose then it has a bomb-proof roof. The roof is possibly about 1.5 meters thick. Then it was used for the convicts, it was used for the Republican internees in 1921, then it reverted back to enlisted ranks accommodation for the British Army until 1938, enlisted ranks accommodation for the Irish Army until 1985, and the Naval Service. And when Spike became a civilian prison in 1985, that's where the prisoners were actually held, and it was destroyed in the riot of 1985 on the 31st of August 1985, and it has been derelict since. As we move across then, the next block is the B block. The B block was always sort of offices, catering and storage areas. It was also then, very interestingly, it was the hospital for the convicts during the convict era of 1847 to 1883. The fabulous building then on the eastern side of the fort we refer to as C block, and in the centre of C block you have the Mitchell Hall with the clock tower. And Mitchell Hall was generally I suppose the simplest description would have been the parish hall of Spike Island, where various events from functions, from dances, from concerts were held. And we still have Christmas carols there every Christmas. Also used during the convict era to house convicts. And they're the principal blocks around the square here on Spike Island. A decision was taken at government level to open Spike Island as a civilian prison in March of 1985. And in order to do so then, the Naval Service had to vacate the island. When it was decided to open the prison then, because obviously it hadn't been designed as a prison, there was an agreement that only low category prisoners would actually be sent down here, but that's not what happened. And there were some high category offenders that ended up here, and that resulted then in a serious riot happening in the end of August of 1985, and during that riot then A block was totally destroyed by fire, as was the eastern end of the B block. The A block was never restored, however we did rebuild the eastern half of the B block, and that then became the new prison kitchen and the offices. Okay, we're standing now on bastion number 3. Now, the fort itself is roughly star-shaped with 6 points on the star, and each of those points is referred to as a bastion. Starting with the bastion on the northwest corner is 1, and moving around then anti-clockwise 2 and 3. So we're here on the south central bastion. And standing here, you can clearly then see why these forts in the harbour were so important. The forts were built at a time when the only way that you could have international cross-water travel was by boat. Therefore, the sea lanes had to be kept secure at all stages, and even more so in time of war. And warships had to be harboured in harbours that were protected by these coastal forts. So the purpose of the fort then was to protect the shipping that was lying at anchor within the harbour, and also then to use the harbours as a secure base from which to move convoys or move warships and to protect your sea lanes. And here in Cork Harbour then we have probably the most heavily defended fort in the world. We have the second largest natural harbour and possibly the most heavily defended fort. Initially, there were 3 forts protecting the harbour at the entrance, and later then, one of them, Cove Fort, was closed because it had been built in the wrong place. It was built with high ground behind it, and the British realised that if an enemy had captured the high ground, it would have been impossible to protect and defend the fort. So they closed Cove Fort and built one here on Spike Island, which is in the south central part of the defence. As you come into the harbour then, through the only entrance past Roach's Point, on the eastern end, on the eastern side of the harbour, you've Fort Carlisle, now called Fort Davis, which is the only fort still used by the military. Straight across from it then, you have a very nice, a very popular fort called Camden Fort Maher. Camden was its original British name, then it was changed to Fort Maher. It's now called Camden Fort Maher. It is also open for as a public tourist attraction, and highly recommended that you should visit there. There's another smaller fort which was built much later in 1910 called Fort Temple Breedy. Then you have our fort here on Spike Island, built between approximately 1804 and 1860, and that is the purpose of all of these forts. Then, when ships became diesel electric, there was no need then for coastal forts. So that's why they went from being very important until possibly the mid-1940s and mid-1950s to being of no relevance, because ships could defend themselves. And between ships and radar and maritime patrol aircraft, then these once very important forts became obsolete. And by looking out at the entrance to Cork Harbour, you can see how important they were, because just off the south coast of Ireland, you've one of the busiest shipping lanes still to this day in the world, because that's the southwestern approaches, and that sea covers northern France, all of the North Sea ports, and the UK. So it is still a very, very important sea lane, even in the 21st century. Now, we have lots of guns here on Spike Island for our visitors to see. Large ones, middle-sized ones and small ones. And behind me is one of the smaller ones. It's a 12-pounder coastal gun. And why it's very important here, it's one of 4 that we have here, and they still work. We fire them every so often, and they're the saluting battery for Cork Harbour. There's a similar saluting battery for Dublin Harbour with the very same 12-pounder guns. And for special occasions then, we'd apply to the Defence Forces to have these guns fired, and the Army would actually send crews down and carry out the ceremony. Spike Island was used as a convict depot during the Irish famine, and it was used as a convict depot between 1847 and 1883. And we're now going into one of the only blocks that was built specifically to house the convicts, and it's now referred to as the punishment block. And you'll see that the conditions were fairly severe in there, and there are lots of artefacts in there and lots of mannequins to illustrate how difficult it was to be incarcerated inside in this particular part of Spike Island. We're now here in the entrance room to the punishment block with some of the furniture similar to what would have been here when it was operational. And this block then was part of the major restoration work carried out during the winter of 2015 and early 2016. Prior to that, the building was derelict. And in here then, what we have is we worked in conjunction with the UCC Archaeology Department, and this is just an example of some of the equipment that the UCC archaeologists and an actual international team of archaeologists would have used over the years that they were carrying out research here on Spike Island. And the research was specifically aimed at finding out as much as possible about the convicts that were here at the time, and that included some removal of some of the human remains in the convict graveyard, which is located on the southwestern corner of the island. Now we're just going into one of the rooms then that has some of the artefacts associated with the convict era. Some massive padlocks and cell door locks, handcuffs and keys, and some of the buttons belonging to the prison, the warder service. The convict service was what they were referred to, what we now call the prison service. And the letter A is a very interesting feature. The convicts were graded, and they wore their grade as a letter on their tunic, and that letter A was found during the archaeology dig down in the vicinity of the convict graveyard. We're now moving in then to one of the cells that would have been used during the convict era, and you'll be able to compare the convict cell of the mid-19th century to the massive improvement in conditions in the modern era. And of course, during the convict era, then dampness, disease, illness took its toll, and approximately 1,200 of the convicts that were imprisoned here died and are buried on the island. But a lot of people then, what they did was they broke the law simply to get into prison
because they have no space to live.
Because they just could not survive on the outside, and they felt that at least if they were in prison, they were going to be fed. Now the food was fairly bland. It was primarily bread and milk. And when the archaeologists were here, they tried it for a day, and while it was certainly filling, it wouldn't have been very nourishing. And of course, hygiene would have been poor, sanitation, and then the diseases that some of these unfortunate convicts would have actually brought into prison would have, so disease would have killed quite a lot of them.
So convict is a general term for whoever was accused and got the sentence?
Yeah, they were convicted.
Okay.
Yeah, and we're talking about really 1847 to 1883. And at the time, Spike Island had a prison population of approximately 2,300, which made it one of the largest convict prisons in the world at the time. That's about it really. There isn't really, just if you want to have a look at some more of the cells. Welcome to the gun park here on Spike Island. Now, the gun park was once one of the 3 exercise yards for the modern prison, and when it opened then as a heritage site, we had lots of space, but we were lacking in covered space. So what we did was we simply covered in one of the 3 exercise yards, and what it contains our very unique collection of artillery pieces, and the first one here is identical to the 2 outside the main gate, one of the 3 that we removed from the pier. A simple cannonball with a cannon ball similar to that would have been fired from that particular gun. The next one then is a unique piece. It's also a cannon, but it's a rifled cannon. And what that means is that there's rifling inside in the barrel. The shell had still to be loaded down through the breech, but the rifling in the barrel meant that when the shell came out, it was actually twisting on its axis, which made it more accurate. And this particular ginormous gun was buried on Spike Island just outside the main gate, and it was excavated back in the mid-1990s. It had a very interesting history in the sense that it was given to the army. They passed it on to somebody else, and so it came back to Spike in a very roundabout way. In order for the guns and the harbour then to operate on a 24-hour basis, the harbour had to be lit up. And here we have one of the giant searchlights. Now, the searchlights would be more common as anti-aircraft, part of the anti-aircraft defence. So these were anti-aircraft searchlights that were originally coastal defence searchlights. Defence Electric Light, DEL would be their official title, and they were burning two carbon rods were being burning on a DC voltage. So there was no massive bulb, it was more like a welding machine. So just 2 carbon rods burning was the source of light with a mirror behind them. Now, the next gun then is identical to the ones that were above in the saluting battery, except this one has a gun shield, which makes it a very rare piece. So it's a 12-pounder gun with a steel gun shield. The next size up then in coastal defence from the 12-pounder would have been the 4.7 inch. And this is a 4.7 coastal gun. Extremely rare. It was British built, but between the First and Second Wars, the British gave them to the Japanese Navy. And of course then between the British and the Japanese, they proceeded to sink all the Japanese vessels that had these 4.7 guns. So extremely rare. There are just 2 of them in Ireland, one above and the other heritage site at Fort Dunree in County Donegal. Now all of these guns then, the larger ones from the 4.7, the 6-inch, two of which are on Spike Island, and the 9.2-inch guns, they were first of all indirect fire weapon, and in a lot of cases the crews could not see their targets. So this is where the battery observation post came in. The battery observation post was manned by officers and NCOs that could actually determine through triangulation where the target was. They then had to determine its direction and speed and calculate then the range and elevation of the guns. So this was very much the brains behind the coastal defence. And the coastal defence battery observation post on Spike Island was on Bastion 3, but because quite a lot of our visitors couldn't physically get there, we brought the battery observation post in here to the gun park so we can actually explain the purposes of the battery observation post to our visitors. We just moved to this one then. This is an L60 Bofors anti-aircraft gun. And why that's next in the chain, when coastal defence became obsolete, it was quite late in the Irish Defence Forces. The Army Reserve used them until the 1970s. But when it was finally disbanded, they re-rolled the reserve gunners into what was called anti-aircraft gunners, and they gave them 2 L60 Bofors, and this is actually one of the 2 that were based here in Spike Island between 1980 and 1985, and it has been immaculately restored then by the Army Reservists in the local town of Cove, who would have operated this particular gun when it was on charge to the military. The L60 then was replaced by the L70, which is the anti-aircraft gun with all the shells, slightly larger brass-coloured shells. And while the L60 was all manually operated, manually aimed, the L70 was radar operated. So the ISO container between the 2 guns is actually the brains of the L70 system. You can see the radar scanner at the top of the ISO container, and the control for the radar is actually housed inside the ISO container. The front and back wheels of the ISO container then can be detached, and the container can be used and it can be airlifted by the likes of a Chinook or a Merlin or a Sea King from one area to another. So the L70 control system would operate maybe 3 or 4 guns at a time, and manually all you had to do was keep loading ammunition onto it. The radar did the rest. It calculated the angle to the target and would be still devastating against the likes of medium helicopters or very slow moving aircraft. Now in the other types of guns then that we have here and shown in the gun park, the light coloured one is an 18-pounder gun dating back to the First World War. The only difference is that in the First World War it would have had timber cartwheels, but for pulling by road then, the Irish put these steel wheels with the rubber tyres on it. The 18-pounder then was replaced by the 25-pounder, which is again magnificently restored here on Spike Island, and that would have been a field gun and also a weak anti-tank gun during the Second War. The tanks became too powerful. The 25-pounder couldn't destroy the German tanks, so the Allies invented and produced a 17-pounder anti-tank, which is the next one, and was capable of destroying any known German tank in the Second War. And the reason we've left that colour, we didn't want everything olive drab in here. That's the colour that it would have been painted during the desert campaign, because both the 25-pounder and the 17-pounder would have seen action in the Western Desert during the Second War. The last gun that we have here then is an L60. It's grey. It's identical to the L60 Army, except the Army one is green and has wheels. This one is battleship grey, and it was bolted onto the deck of a number of the Irish naval vessels. And the L60 in the Naval Service was replaced by the L70 in the Naval Service, and we're awaiting delivery of one of those. Now, I did mention that the gun park was once an exercise yard, and if you just look on the wall here, on the western side and actually on the eastern side, you can see the outline of the goalpost, because inmates would have been held in the adjoining northeast casemates, and this was their exercise yard. And of course, one of the main pastimes out in the exercise yard was playing football. Now, up at the far end then, to go from the guns then, we have two vehicles. We have a Scorpion tank, which drove in here just December of 2018, and we have an extremely rare mobile workshop. It was used by the Defence Forces during the 40s and 50s when they had heavy tanks. If a tank broke down, you couldn't lift it, you couldn't tow it, you actually had to bring the garage to the tank. So this is the mobile workshop, and on board it has a forge, it has a lathe, drill, electric hacksaw, just all of the main items and the main piece of equipment for a mobile workshop. And it was accompanied by a bus which had been converted as a stores. So if one of the heavy Churchill tanks broke down, the garage and the stores and the personnel went to where it was broken down and then had to repair it so it could move again under its own steam. There are two small guns up there then. There's a ground 90 anti-tank rifle, which is a recoilless rifle. It's an infantry weapon. And then you have a 120mm mortar, which is an artillery weapon. And that's the sum total of the items in the gun park. We're now going into the Independence Museum, which was only opened in July of 2019, and it covers the history of Spike Island and in Ireland in general from 1914 to 1938. So immediately inside the front door gives the very brief outline as to the Irish involvement in the First World War. The Irish regiments that were involved, the two specific ones here would have been the South Irish Horse and the Royal Munster Fusiliers, and the casualties and those that were recruited into the British forces during the First World War. So you can see now some of the recruiting posters for the Irish regiments. This one is specifically the Royal Munster Fusiliers. You can see the Irish teamed recruiting poster for the British forces, the Irish Wolfhound and the Irish Piper and the green flag. And then another Irish regiment, this was a reserve cavalry regiment, the South Irish Horse, and some of the details then of the Irish involvement in the First World War. We're now moving into 1916 and the 1916 Rising. And during the 1916 Rising, they were very much dependent on support from Germany and Russian rifles and weapons that were captured by the Germans from the Russians, specifically the Mosin-Nagant rifle. So the Germans sent about 20,000 Russian rifles, 1 million rounds of ammunition, 10 Maxim machine guns. But unfortunately, the Royal Navy were expecting the cargo and the ship, the Odd, and they captured the ship off the Kerry coast and the southwest coast of Ireland and ordered the captain, Captain Spindler, to sail his vessel to Queenstown, or Cove. And just at the entrance to Cork Harbour, he scuttled the vessel. And some of the artefacts then that are here are directly associated and were found on the ship, because after the crew scuttled the ship, the crew were rescued by a Royal Naval vessel and brought here to Spike Island. So that's our direct involvement with the 1916 Rising. Now, here then, you have some of the artefacts that were taken off the Odd. The rifle in the background is a Russian Mosin-Nagant rifle, 7.62mm, and it would have been perfect for the volunteers, simple to operate, simple to maintain. However, they were not to be delivered until Easter Sunday night, which was far too late, no time to distribute, no time to train, no time to prepare. As well as that, then 1 million rounds sounds a massive amount of ammunition, but when you think of it, there were 20,000 rifles. That's only 50 rounds per rifle, but there were various calibers, so the ammunition, in effect, there were too many rifles and not enough ammunition. So if they had brought in far less rifles and far more ammunition, but as well as that, they needed to bring both in early so that they could actually distribute and train the volunteers.
It is the first rebellion that ever took place in Ireland where you had a majority on your side. And now we were washing out.
And here we have cutouts of illustrating some of the various uniforms that would have been worn during the 1916 Rising. An Irish volunteer with his red hand cap badge, a British soldier from the 1916 era, an officer of the Irish Volunteers, and here we have illustrated a lady of the Coming Amon, the women's organisation, women's volunteers. From here then, we're moving into the 1919, 1921 to the War of Independence. And again, we have illustrations of some of the various forces. So we have 3 members of the Crown Forces. We have an auxiliary, member of the Auxiliary Division, Royal Irish Constabulary, a British soldier, an RIC constable, and we have the infamous black and tan, the early pattern with an RIC shotgun, and then we have an Irish volunteer. Now, the Irish volunteer uniform would not have been worn in any engagement. That was more for ceremonial. We have some artefacts then directly relating to men that were held on Spike Island when it was opened as a military prison and a military internment camp in 1921. There were approximately 1,400 men held here during 1921. Approximately 800 of them were internees, the remainder were convicted Republican prisoners. Some of their medals, some of their diaries, some silver jewellery that was made by the internees here. Another pop-up, this was again the infamous Auxiliary Division, and this was the last uniform worn by the Auxiliary, which was an RIC constable's uniform with their unique headdress of the Auxiliary Division. Here then we have a court scene, and this has been heavily researched, and it's an indication, it's just an example, and shows people what the internees and the prisoners that were held here in 1921 had to face. So these are 3 British Army officers in a military court scene, and when the visitor stands in front of them, that visitor then becomes the prisoner or the internee, and whatever the charge is, whatever the conviction, and whatever sentence is given is actually what happened. We've researched it to that extent, and all of the men that are mentioned, that are listed, ended up here as either internees or prisoners. So we've been sentenced now, and we're moving after our trial and after our conviction, after our sentence, we're now being sent to the military prison and Spike or the military internment camp. So now we're going to jail. Hello. So now, after the sentence, the individual would have found themselves incarcerated either as a military, in the military prison on Spike Island for the Republicans that were convicted, or the military internment camp on Spike Island for those that were interned. And this is the story of Spike Island in 1921, when those 1,400 men were held here. And the individuals that are covered in the court scene are photographed here on the wall. Tom Malone, Dick Barrett. Dick Barrett was one of, there were 2 successful escapes from Spike Island in 1921. 3 men escaped in April and 7 escaped in November of 1921. One of those that escaped in April was the brother of the former Lord Mayor of Cork, Terence McSweeney. His name was Sean McSweeney, and he was a convicted prisoner here. Another man then that escaped in November was Dick Barrett, and Dick Barrett was one of the officers, he was one of the leaders of the internees here, had a successful escape. However, less than 12 months later, he was captured in the fall of the Fourth Coast in the Civil War, and he was executed in Mountjoy. Now we have some of the original autograph books then that were produced by the internees and prisoners, and we have the originals, and we have digital copies of them. Now, top of the left here then is Pat White. Pat White was an internee, and he was playing hurling out in the square. The ball he was playing with went near the barbed wire fence. He went to retrieve it, and the sentry fired on him, fatally wounding him. And he died about an hour later from gunshot wound. He was one of 2 prisoners or internees that were shot fatally in 1921. He was shot and died within an hour. Another prisoner actually was shot in the foot and died of blood poisoning a couple of weeks later. And now we're going from 1938 and the handover. The forts were so important to the British that they received permission to stay in 2 forts in the south, here in Cork Harbour and the other in Castletownbere, and one in the northwest called Fort Dunree in Lochswilly. And all of them were handed over July, August and September of 1938. And we have some original artefacts relating to the handover of 1938 and some film footage. Okay, now we're jumping back to that now again for a second. To finish the story then of the approximately 1,400 men that were held here in 1921, we have the Genealogy Room, and here we've created 2 databases with substantial information and heavily researched information primarily from the UK National Archives in Kew on the details of the internees and the Republican prisoners. And these have been put onto 2 databases where historians or families can actually come in and research the story behind the men, and we have photographs of quite a few of them. And this is a map of the fort in 1921 showing the various locations. Top of the right, F and G, that would be where the gun park is now, is F, and that's where the Republican prisoners were held in what were the north-east casemates. And amazingly, when it was opened as a prison in 1985, that's where the civilian prisoners were put in. A and B then are where the internees were held, and again, amazingly, when it opened in 1985, A was where the civilian prisoners, and we've already covered that, and B is the B block where the internees were held in 1921 in wooden huts. Now, when the British military left Spike Island in 1938, the Irish Army moved in here, and this is the story of the Irish Army here on Spike Island from 1938, and not alone up to 1985 when they moved out of here, but in fact up to the present day. So we have some artefacts, photographs of the guns being fired. That's an old Irish Army push bike. These are some of the shells, not alone associated with coast defence, but in fact the Irish Defence Forces. Now here we have a 6-inch shell. So we've covered the 12-pounder shells. Well, these are the shells that would have been fired by the 12-pounder guns. The large black one in the corner would have been fired by the 6-inch guns here on Spike Island, and this one here was also a 6-inch gun. And this ginormous one here, the black one, this is a 9.2-inch shell, and the largest coastal defence guns in Cork Harbour, they were located in Fort Davis and in Fort Temple Breedy, were 9.2-inch guns. Unfortunately, all of them have been cut up since. And these are just some guns. So we've a Thompson submachine gun, a 303 rifle, and a Peter the Painter pistol, so that the visitors can get a bit of a hands-on feel on what weapons feel like and the weight of them. And this then is a selection of the uniforms of the Irish Army, from dress uniforms to service uniforms to camouflage uniform for desert pattern. This one specifically was worn in Afghanistan, the service camouflage uniform, some of the earlier ones, and some associated with both the brass band and our pipe band. And some of the delf that we would have used in various messes. Approximately 1979, the Naval Service from Haulbowline moved in here and used as a training depot. And in order to remember the men and women of the Irish Naval Service that served on Spike Island in those years, we have put together this Naval Room showing a selection of the uniforms that would have been worn at home and indeed overseas, some of the artefacts, and photographs of some of the senior officers. And when the prison opened here in March of 1985, the Naval Service then marched out. When the British military were here until 1938, and when members of the Irish Defence Forces were here until 1985, their families lived with them on the houses out on the island. And this is the story then of the social history of Spike Island. And this illustrates some of the British and Irish military families that lived on the island when their husband or their father was serving in the fort. This is the organ that was used in the chapel on Spike Island, and it was given to a chap in Cove who kindly donated it to us, and we had it nicely restored, and it works now. Welcome to C-Class here on Spike Island. C-Class is where we tell the story of the modern prison between 1985 and 2004. So here we have an exhibition of shivs and shanks. These are the improvised weapons that inmates would make, generally to do harm to fellow inmates, but sometimes used against prison officers. And these are shivs and shanks that would have been used here in Spike and also in Cork Prison. So we can move down then. Each of the three wings were self-contained in that they had their cells, they had their recreation hall, and they had their exercise yard. And we saw the exercise yard for the B class, which was now the gun park. So down here then, so we're now in the cellular area of C class where the 6 four-man cells are. And in addition to the four-man cells, there was in-cell sanitation. Spike Island was one of the first prisons that had in-cell sanitation for 100 of the 102, and the other 2 had their toilets just outside the cell door. Another addition we had here was to put televisions into the cells, and the televisions paid for themselves very quickly, because prior to the introduction of the televisions in the cells, the inmates were wrecking their cells every so often out of boredom. Whereas when we put the televisions into the cells, they behaved themselves much better because they did not want to lose the television. If they had messed up in their cell, we would actually take the television off them as a sort of a penalty. They did not want that, so there was a major improvement in their conduct within the cells after we putting the televisions in there. There were a couple of risks involved in having inmates locked in here. One was fire, and in a scenario where the prisoners simply wedged their cell door, which opened in, it meant if they set fire to their cell, we couldn't actually get into them until we took the door down. So the idea of these apertures was that in the event of a fire, you could inundate the cell with water in the event of a fire. But what they were generally used for was just passing newspapers or magazines from one cell to the other at night when they were locked up. Because remember that while there would have been an officer on duty here at night, that officer, whether it was male or female, did not have access to the cells. We're now in the number 2 bastion, and we're in the underground emplacement of the 6-inch gun here in number 2 bastion. There are two 6-inch guns remaining on Convict Island. This one obviously, and the second one in an identical emplacement over in bastion number 4, which would be the southeast corner. This is the southwest corner of the fort, and bastion 2. And the guns were originally mounted in bastion 3, where the saluting guns are now, and moved here in about 1943. And they've been fully restored. The first time they were restored was during the prison service era by some of the inmates that were here. Some of the staff and inmates restored them as a project, and they were further restored then by some of the volunteers here. So they're in excellent condition. How the gun was fired was the chamber, the breech block was open fully, and the projectile or shell was rammed into the breech. A bag of gunpowder was put in afterwards, then, depending on the range. It could be a half charge or full charge. A half charge was 1 small bag, a full charge was 2 small bags. Then the breech was closed. The breech was closed, but before it was locked, there was a little bullet put in here. That was the igniter. So it was a bullet with no head in it. So when it was struck, the flame went in, ignited the gunpowder, the charge exploded, and the gun fired. So we now have the shell gone in, we have the charge gone in, we have the igniter gone in, and we're now going to lock the breech. So the breech is now locked. It's cocked, so it's ready to go. The battery observation post that we saw earlier would have communicated then the elevation of the barrel and the amount of traverse left or right to hit the target. Now, because of the speed of the target and because of the time of flight from here to the target, you did not aim where the target was. You had to anticipate where the target would be so that the target and the shell would converge. So on the instruction fire, the lanyard was pulled, the trigger, it isn't a hammer, the firing pin fired, ignited the bullet or the charge, which ignited the cordite. The cordite exploded, shell was on its way. So when you unloaded then, the only thing that was left was the remnants of the bullet. So you opened it. This was all smouldering. You could not load another round because if you did, the cordite would potentially explode in your face. So that's what the bucket was for, to wash out the breech in between firing. So after every round was fired, you washed the breech, and then the sequence was repeated. Again, never fired in anger.